Hey everyone, welcome to Being Well. I'm Forrest Hanson. If you're new to the show, thanks for listening today. And if you've listened before, welcome back. When I started creating content about psychology and self development about a decade ago, I would not have guessed that self compassion, of all things, would be one of the things that people reacted to the most strongly. Many people really struggle with applying self compassion, and the phrase alone can elicit some cringes. Self compassion seems like a pretty basic good thing, right? It's the ability to be kind to ourselves when things are difficult and show ourselves the same care and support we might have for a friend who's going through a hard time. So, if that's such a good thing, what's going on here? Why do so many people seem to struggle with self compassion? And what can we do about it? To help me answer some of those questions, I'm joined by Dr. Chris Germer. Dr. Germer is a clinical psychologist, a part time lecturer on psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and the author, co author, and co editor of a number of books, including The Mindful Path to Self Compassion and Mindfulness and Psychotherapy, which is regularly used in graduate programs. And he's also the co developer of the Mindful Self Compassion program with Dr. Kristen Neff, who we've had the pleasure of speaking with on the show in the past. And together they co authored 3 books now on mindful self compassion, including their most recent, Mindful Self Compassion for Burnout, which just came out. So, congratulations about that, Chris.
Thanks, Forrest. And it's so nice to be here to speak with you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, same. Really looking forward to this one. So glad to talk to you and so glad to have you here, in part because I have experienced these struggles with self compassion myself. And I've definitely talked with a lot of people who have that kind of difficult relationship with self compassion. But as somebody who's been exploring these topics for a really long time, I want to start just by asking you, has that also been your experience?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, self-compassion is a little more mainstream, so we don't get as much pushback. But in the early days, everybody said, "Oh my goodness, self-compassion, selfishness, self-compassion training is only going to make me more selfish and narcissistic, and don't we have enough of that already?" And then when people hear compassion in the general public, they often think of weakness. They say, "Oh my goodness, I have too much of that already. I'm too sensitive already to how other people feel, and I can't add any more compassion to my life. I'll just be overwhelmed." So, as you said, there's a kind of a cringe factor. It's decreasing, but it's definitely there. But the good news, of course, is that there are over 7,000 studies on this subject now, and across the board, it shows it's good for you. It decreases distress, increases well-being, even improves relationships. When we talk about self-compassion, we have a lot of support, you might say,
Yeah.
but still people are wary. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that some of that wariness gets to, and you even kind of named a few of them there, and just what you were saying, some of the common misconceptions or misunderstandings that people have about self compassion. A really common one is some version of, well, the challenges that I face when compared to the challenges faced by so many people can seem very, very small and kind of meaningless in comparison. Can I really extend myself? That sort of feeling when so many other people out there have it worse.
People worry that it will make them a little bundle of sorrow and suffering, in other words, self-pity. But actually, the research shows that people who are high in self-compassion, they have more perspective on what they're going through, and also they ruminate less. So that's one. Another one is self-indulgence. People think, "Oh, I learned self-compassion. I'm just going to sit around and watch TV and eat bonbons." But the research shows people who are high in self-compassion, they actually take better care of themselves. They sleep when they're tired. They go to the doctor when they need to. Really, the deal is that when people are self-compassionate, they take better care of themselves, and just sort of
Hmm.
laying around and doing nothing and being complacent is not taking better care of ourselves. Perhaps the biggest one is demotivation. And people think that if I'm more self-compassionate, I'll lose my edge. In other words, if I'm not self-critical and I'm kind of self-encouraging, maybe I'm not getting enough of a kick in the butt. What the research shows is that people who are high in self-compassion, they actually have as high standards as anyone else, but they're actually more motivated to achieve them because they're motivating themselves with kindness and self-appreciation and respect, rather than harsh self-criticism, which will get us out of the chair, but it won't get us to the goal line, to actually
Yeah.
stick with it, we need encouragement. We need a good coach, you know?
I would love to drop you into a situation talking with somebody who thinks or feels these things, Chris. And maybe we can use that situation as a way in to talking about a lot of what we want to talk about today.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, let's say that you're talking to somebody, either they've walked into your office or as often happens, you're at the end of some talk you've given about this topic. They come up, they say hi to you, and they say something along the lines of this. I hear what you're saying. This all sounds really nice. These all sounds like things that would be great for me to be able to access. But man, I'm just doing a normal job. It's a hard job, but it's a normal job. Plenty of other people do some hard jobs and they seem to make it work. I've got stressful stuff going on in my life, but how can I take a break right now when there's so much that's going on? And then sometimes I try to apply these self-compassion tools that you teach, Chris, and they're great tools, they're helpful stuff, but I just kind of keep feeling bad because the things in my life that are stressing me out are still stressing me out. Like, oh, Forrest, care for yourself in different ways, but man, I've still got these challenges out there. So between those things, I've just really struggled with all of this, and I'm sure that there's something else in there that I should be doing, but I don't really know what it is. What do you think about this?
Well, I can tell you what would go on in my mind
Yeah, that would
at
be
that
great.
time first. First of all, I would appreciate in my spirit that the person has attended a talk or come to a workshop, and that I would acknowledge either verbally or to myself that that is already an act of self-compassion. In other words, the wish to do something good for oneself by cultivating self-compassion. And then, is more or less the concern, it's not working for me because the conditions of my life haven't changed. And then what would go through my mind, and I might say it in some form, is it does take time. It does take time. And sometimes we really need to change the conditions of our lives, not just how we relate to those conditions, and that then brings up the subject of tender versus fierce self-compassion. Tender self-compassion is like being with ourselves in some kind way as we would for a friend, but fierce self-compassion is taking action in the world. Maybe the job is not the right thing for that person, or maybe there are some boundaries that need to be made on that job. But in at the very deepest level, what I might be thinking when a person presented that situation is, I wonder how they're practicing. I wonder how they're practicing because sometimes people are feeling anxious or depressed, and the sole criteria for whether or not the practice works is if they feel less anxious and less depressed. And that's a reasonable request. But the problem is that it has kind of the seed of um, uh, its
Demise.
own demise, which is because when self-compassion is real, we are actually opening to the pain in our lives and
Hmm.
responding with kindness without any strings attached. The same way we would respond to kindness, the same way we would be kind to a child with the 5-day flu and it's only the first day. You're not thinking, okay, I'm only going to be kind to my child because if this is going to end the flu, it's not like that. We say,
Mm-hmm.
no, child is suffering. I'm
Yeah.
kind to the child. Similarly, can we in fact be kind to ourselves because we're anxious, because we're depressed, because we have a lousy job, rather than expecting that this should, miraculously overnight change anything? So basically, if we front load the kindness in this way, inevitably it works better, but it still may take some time depending on the gravity of the situation.
I think this really gets to something you've written and spoken a lot about, which you call the paradox of self compassion, which is
Yeah.
that essentially, yeah, we give ourselves that self compassion not to solve a problem necessarily, although it can help with that, or to feel better necessarily, although it often helps with that too, but because we feel bad. And I think that that kind of difference in intent is what you're really speaking to here.
That's what it is. Yeah. And then
Yeah.
there's so that's yeah, what we call the core paradox of practice, because most people practice to manipulate how they feel, and that's resistance. And what we resist persists. But what we can feel, we can heal. So what would it take to actually open to the experience and then, give ourselves the most natural thing when we're suffering, which is kindness. But there's a related paradox, and that is, when we suffer, we practice not to perfect ourselves, but to embrace our imperfections. Or, as Jack Kornfield says, the point of practice is not to perfect ourselves, but to perfect our love. In other words, and when there's suffering, that means perfect our compassion. So it's a tricky thing. It's definitely paradoxical, and right out of the box, this makes no sense whatsoever. But when somebody's been practicing for a while and then they've hit a wall, i.e., I can't go any further than this, it really uh, is an invitation to have a different intention, different motivation, different approach to the whole thing. We're getting right to the heart of this, Forrest, and you clearly know a lot about self-compassion.
Ah,
So
well,
this is
thanks,
this is a
Chris. I
lot of fun.
appreciate
This
it.
is a lot of fun for me because usually it takes like an hour and a half to get to this where we are now.
Hey,
This is
love that.
this is the very essence of self-compassion. If people stopped listening right now, they would have like heard it all.
Well, for starters, love to hear it. Very respectful of people's time out there. We definitely try to get to it. And I appreciate that also on a personal level, Chris. It definitely means a lot to me. And just to kind of keep going here, because I think that you, kind of like you're saying, you've already gotten to the place where I was kind of hoping that we would go to some extent. With this person, and I've been this person I was modeling. I've been that person, at least to some extent. You guys talk about, when I say you guys, I'm referring to you and Dr. Kristen Neff, talk about various prerequisites for self compassion that exist out there. The first one of these is the ability to perceive that somebody is struggling. Like we need to be able to see ourselves as having a kind of problem or having a kind of challenge. If you think back to the person I just modeled, well, they're downplaying all of their challenges to some extent, right? They're saying, well, other people have it worse. Is it really that bad? All of that. Then next, you talk about needing to feel kind of a connection or a kinship with other people amidst that suffering, common humanity. This is a normal human experience, all of that. There might have been a little bit of that there, but again, it was kind of downplaying and denying and sort of pushing away to some extent. And then you need a generally warm and kind attitude toward ourselves. And the person might have had that. They were showing up to the workshop, they were interested in talking with you about it. Those are all good signs. But you can kind of see in the role play the presence or absence of these different things and maybe connected to that a little bit. One of the major reasons that people struggle with self compassion, at least in my experience, is that they feel like they are just fundamentally um, not worthy of it, for lack of a better way of putting it. Like, how can I feel compassion for somebody who really has done bad things? And I know in my mind every single bad thought I have ever had, every
Yeah.
bad thing I've ever done, I've got
Right.
the whole
Right.
catalog in there.
Yeah.
So, how can I extend compassion to myself? And then we get into the shame piece of it, and that's a major part of your work.
Yeah. So there are many ways that we render ourselves unqualified for self-compassion. And one is, yeah, other people have it worse than me. Another is, I don't deserve it. If you only knew, there are many different ways that we minimize both our suffering, in other words, not open to suffering, and also interfere with our ability to receive the medicine, which is kindness and compassion. For this whole thing to work, we really do need to, first of all, be able to open to the suffering where we feel. We actually need to validate it. Actually, being kind to ourselves and seeing things as part of common humanity kind of opens the door to feeling suffering. But if we actually don't contact our struggles, then we won't be able to give ourselves the kindness that we need. So there are really two things. There's, can I open to pain? And then, can I give myself the kindness that I need? We have to be able to open to our pain in some way. But then when it comes to giving ourselves kindness and not being deserving, we need to go very slowly with that, because often what people are concerned about is not so much that they're not deserving, but what may get kicked up emotionally when I start giving myself compassion. In other words, if I start saying to myself, may I begin to accept myself just as I am, we're very likely to start thinking about many times in the past when we were either not treated in an acceptable way or aspects of ourselves that are not acceptable. So people are, excuse me, afraid of what we call backdraft or kind of difficult emotions and old wounds that could arise. So that is often part of the I'm not deserving part. It's like the suspicion that something is going to come up inside that is a little stronger than I can deal with around the area of shame that you just described. But when somebody feels just a lot of shame, like let's just assume they know they feel shame, they're not like afraid of something erupting, they've got it, they know it, but I'm not deserving. Then we have to go very, very gently into this. We have to go very gently into this. And in particular, ask ourselves, how could I care for myself in a way that would feel genuinely good? And one thing, for example, that people who have a lot of shame, particularly shame associated with trauma, um, can do is they're really good uh, taking care of others. So, for example, if somebody has a dog, they might take really good care of the dog, but not such good care of themselves because the dog deserves it, but I don't. But actually, by taking care of the dog, there is a sense of well-being that comes in. There's a sense of worthiness that comes in. I'm a good caretaker of my. So there's always a way in. There's always a way in. Sometimes the way in is by caring for others, which then warms up our awareness and starts to activate compassion. And then we just need to include ourselves in the circle of compassion. In other words, in order for my dog to be well, then I need to be well. I can't like starve myself and feed my dog. Actually, I need to feed myself for my dog. You follow what I'm saying? In other words,
Mm-hmm.
one
Yeah,
of the
absolutely.
ways one of the ways of overcoming this sense of non-deservedness is by focusing on who actually deserves compassion in our immediate environment, giving that one compassion, and then tucking ourselves in, sneaking ourselves in. In other words, including ourselves in the circle of compassion.
I think that's, for starters, very clever, Chris, as kind of like a way to Trojan horse some of these
That's a
ideas in
Trojan horse.
here.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Only it's
And I
not
and
full of the enemy. It's full of the medicine.
That's right. It's full of self compassion there, which is
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah.
And one of the things we talk about, I want to focus in a little bit on what you said there about backdraft for a second, because it's very, very common. And something we talk about on the show with some regularity is experiencing out. So the basic idea is that we have all of these feelings inside that we avoid in different kinds of ways. And sometimes you need to feel the feeling in order to be able to work with the feeling to kind of get it up there. And sometimes what happens which you detail in the book with Kristen very, very well, is when people first start kind of applying that self compassion to themselves, something about the system in some way that's kind of hard to put your finger on sort of senses that this is an opportunity to do that. Enough safety has been created. We've got that secure base. We're giving ourselves the chance to kind of get in there and feel some of those feelings that we need to feel. But then those feelings do not feel good. And we go, oh, don't want to do that again. So this is a very common process for people. I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this. And I'm wondering, once they get to the, oh, don't want to do that again phase, how do you work with people around it? Are there things that they can do or tools that they can apply?
So first of all, I would honor that stuff is coming up that might be a little too much to handle at the time, and this is actually a sign of progress. That is to say, it's a sign that the medicine is in the body, is in the system, that it's actually doing its work, that feeling, these strong emotions and old wounds, this is actually fundamental to the transformation process. So we want to make sure that that backdraft is normalized, that people understand that this is actually how compassion heals. This is actually how it heals when we can meet what arises with kindness, compassion, common humanity, and mindfulness. In other words, to hold it in a loving and understanding way as it probably was not held when it happened originally. So we want to make sure that people don't like freak out over this, that understand this is a good thing, but we have to work skillfully with it. In other words, we don't want too much backdraft. If somebody had trauma history, we don't want them to be re-traumatized. If somebody, we don't want people to get overwhelmed with difficult emotions. So when we work with self-compassion, if you can think of three concentric circles, the center is safety, the next circle is challenge, and the outer circle is overwhelm. If we ever start to feel overwhelmed, we want to move towards safety. We want to stay either in the safe space, which usually means we're comfortable but not learning too much, or in the challenge space, which is optimal learning. But when we get into the overwhelm, then we learn nothing. So when people have backdraft, particularly if they are overwhelmed with backdraft, then we need to move towards safety. There are a variety of ways of doing this. But as we proceed in self-compassion practice, a nice little motto that we have is, at any point in the practice, ask yourself, lean in, lean back, or let go. If we feel safe, we can lean in. If we feel challenged, we can either lean in or lean back. And if we feel overwhelmed, then we should let go of what we're doing. We should stop doing what we're doing and shift our attention to something else, either present moment experience, anchoring our awareness, or, and this is really important, Forrest, to move from, if somebody's doing mind training or meditation or something, they think this is like the most important way of practicing self-compassion, but it's actually not so. There's an equally important way of practicing self-compassion, and we can shift to this other modality, and that's behavioral self-compassion. Actually, physically taking good care of ourselves, asking the question, if we feel overwhelmed, what do I need? What do I need right now? Do I need to physically comfort myself? Do I need to emotionally soothe myself? Do I need to validate myself? Do I need to protect myself, provide for myself, motivate? What do I need? Do I need to feel safe? How do I do it? And the answer to this is almost always behavioral self-compassion. And this is not a lesser practice. So, but behavioral self-compassion is fundamentally safe because it is so ordinary. So we can always practice self-compassion, even when we have a lot of backdraft, just shifting the way that we're practicing self-compassion.
Could you give just a couple of very quick examples here, Chris, of what you mean by behavioral self-compassion?
So the quintessential self-compassion question is, what do I need? But if we're kind of emotionally overwhelmed, it's hard to answer that question.
It's tough.
So then we gotta break it down. We gotta make it a little more narrow. So in the area of tender self-compassion, we have the categories of comforting, soothing, and validating. So we can say, what do I need to emotionally comfort myself? So maybe that means like pet the dog or listen to music or wrap myself in a blanket.
And those are things in the world you can do. Those are behaviors. Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
exactly. Or what do I need to validate myself? Maybe the most self-compassionate thing is to reach out and talk to a friend, ask, let's go to dinner, or to journal, like to know what we're feeling, things like that. Or what do I need to protect myself? Do I need to say no to something? Do I need to stand up and say no? Or provide for myself? What does it take to provide for myself? What does it take to provide for myself physically, emotionally? What does it take to provide for myself spiritually? Maybe what I really need to do is just sit down and pray, This is all behavioral stuff. And it is fundamentally safe because it's so ordinary, but it is not a lesser practice. In fact, we can practice behavioral self-compassion all day long, whereas how long are we going to meditate? Maximum 1 or 2 hours a day. What do we do with the rest of the day? If we spend the rest of the day abusing ourselves and then we try to learn self compassion in an hour of meditation, waste of time. We want to do both.
Yeah, and I think this also gets to something that you guys put in the book, the recent Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout book that really spoke to me because I thought that it was such a great articulation of something that people really struggle with. It's a line along the lines of when we're in the grip of intense emotions, we need to hold ourselves first before we're able to hold our experience. And this is in a section where you talk about some of the differences between mindfulness and self-compassion. And what I love about these various behavioral practices is, for starters, they get us out of the mind palace, for lack of a better way. You know, what does
Out
my
of our
dad
heads,
say?
yeah.
Yeah, the mind is a cave of bats is one of the lines that he likes. You know, it's all going on there. It's a chaotic place. You got to be careful when you're walking around, and it puts us into direct experience, into things we can actually do out in the world. And also, all of these things are incredibly soothing. They're all forms of holding ourselves, like providing ourselves that safe base from which we can work. And so I really love the behavioral aspect of it. And behavioral activation is a hell of a drug in general if you can get to it. So we get this intuitively when we're interacting with other people. At least most of the people who are listening to a podcast like this one probably get this intuitively, that if we kind of start by joining, right? We start by relating to another person from that stance of hearing their experience or saying, you know, wow, that sounds hard, before getting to here are the 17 things that you can do to solve this problem for yourself. But we aren't always so great at applying that to ourselves. For people who are having a hard time relating to themselves without entering a problem solving mode, because I can speak for myself. I'm a big problem
Yeah.
solver. I'm
Yeah.
I'm there
Yeah.
to give you the 10-point plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm not always so good at being in the more relational space. Are there things, whether it's understandings or just like tactics, that can help people with that?
Yeah. So, in the old analytic framework, there was a thing called flight into action, which was a defense.
Mm.
You know, in other words,
Wow, that's a
like,
great line. I love that.
to
Flight into action. Yeah.
to to do those 10 things, and struggle with them and so forth. It frees me from feeling what it was that was the kick in the butt that made me want to do this in the first place. In other words, what was my suffering? So to actually be aware that I would like to first be present in my experience before I start moving into 10 different solutions is a really important thing. It is such a fact what you said. You said initially when we're going to talk to somebody who's struggling, we want to join with them, but we're not just joining with them because otherwise they won't listen. Period. We're joining with them because we know that by giving people a chance to, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, empty their hearts, they probably are going to figure out what we were going to suggest anyway, or they'll come up with something better. So, what is really um, important when we're trying to help somebody else is to recognize that our presence is often, and our patience and our willingness to listen and to provide space for somebody to open their hearts is probably the best thing that we can do. This we know from interacting with other people. But what is the corollary in self compassion? And the corollary is ultimately loving awareness, mindfulness with a lot of warmth. And in other words, when we're suffering, can we give ourselves the same blessing, the same grace, the same gift? Can we actually sit down and be with ourselves in the same way without, catapulting into action? Because generally speaking, when people are not self-compassionate, they have a whip and they're really, trying to get themselves to do stuff constantly. But what would it take to just sort of put down that whip? And I think the answer is experience, just like experience with other people. When we recognize that actually I don't need to talk and I don't need to recommend, and actually people will get more out of being with me when I don't. When we realize this with other people, we can, in fact, begin to understand the preciousness of being with ourselves with compassionate awareness, with loving awareness, to just sit with ourselves. And we provide a whole host of tools for people to how do we sit with ourselves, how to be with ourselves without having to do anything. So, for example, one way which research shows clearly changes physiology is soothing touch. You put a hand over your heart, and it will definitely decrease cortisol. Just about everybody has this experience, or some other place on their body where which they find comforting and soothing. There's even research that was done pretty close to where you live at UC Berkeley that showed that 20 seconds of soothing touch per day for 1 month significantly decreases stress and increases self-compassion. This is such a small thing, but when we are unable to be with ourselves, in other words, you pointed out sometimes in the midst of intense and disturbing emotions, we have to hold ourselves before we hold our experience. If we don't, if we don't know how to hold ourselves, we can learn self-compassion. We can learn simple things like soothing touch, or asking ourselves, what do I need to hear right now? And then offering ourselves those same words. Or behavioral self-compassion, taking a warm bath. What do you need? Anyhow, so all this allows us to be with ourselves without trying to force ourselves into some remediative action.
Yeah, I think that's really great, Chris. And this connects to a bunch of other things. Like it's kind of just like a web going out a little bit, because the particular topic that you guys were focused on in the most recent book was burnout. And burnout stems from keeping on going when you don't have any battery left, when your batteries run dry, right? But you're keeping on to plug away. And we were talking a minute ago about shame. And one of the things with shame is that there's often a coping mechanism that people have where they do in order to avoid the feeling of not being enough, essentially. Keep on doing so that they don't experience the shame that they're feeling, to validate to themselves that they are, in fact, a good person, even if there's that voice in the back of the head that even while they're doing all that doing, it's still telling them that they are not actually a good person. So it's a little bit of turtles all the way down. It's an attempt to solve a problem, but the solution's not actually helping you that much. And that then leads to burnout. Then the shame voice just absolutely turbocharges because you can't really do it anymore. And now you're stuck. You're stuck in that experience. And along the way, it's really difficult to hold yourself because there's still that underlying model that the person is carrying around of not good enough, can't do this, whatever it is. And for starters, I say that just to think about that person and extend a little bit of, compassion toward the person who's going through that experience. It's a very, very difficult experience to go through. I'm wondering if you've seen it. And in that model that I was kind of describing, are there places that you tend to start with people?
So there are many different causes of burnout, and you named one of them, and that is a kind of relentless striving.
Hmm.
And to some extent, the relentless striving, is, you might say, motivated or driven by shame. A variation on that theme is perfectionism, when good enough is never good enough. And often shame is at the root, because this is, a slight different variation, but the idea is that my self-worth depends on what I do, not who I am. And so shame is behind that. In other words, if we're constantly doing and trying to be perfect, where do we get the idea that, we have to, that first of all, we're going to succeed by being perfect at work, or that we could even be perfect? Where do we get this idea? We get it because being in my own skin, being my own person is not acceptable. I feel shame. The question is, how do we help a person who, for example, is driven by shame, perhaps in perfectionism or excessive striving? And I think the way you framed it is just really clear. In other words, what a person needs to do is in some way get their self-worth in another way, and in particular to deal with the shame. Now, what's interesting about self-compassion is that it actually addresses shame without ever having to call it shame, because some people feel like ashamed of being ashamed. Somebody comes in saying, I'm burnt out. And you say, well, no, you really have a shame problem. You say, oh, geez, thank you for sharing, but we don't have to do that, because self-compassion is a positive resource that is the opposite of shame. I mean, the research is very clear about this. People who are high in self-compassion are low in shame. People who grow in self-compassion reduce their shame. So when somebody is doing anything, perfectionism or striving too hard, coming from shame, all they need to do is to begin to be kind to themselves in ways that they have not heretofore been kind to themselves, in ways that are palatable. Because then what happens is the self-worth gets a different source. So if our self-worth was originally from work, which is known as contingent social approval, in other words, I do this well and somebody likes me and then I'm okay. When our self-worth is due to external approval, it's very fickle and it's very unstable, and frankly, we will never succeed except for a few short moments. But when our self-worth, the source of self-worth is inner kindness. In other words, when there's an inner voice which says, you're doing the best you can. This not a bad start. You've got what it takes. You've also got the discipline. You can figure this out. You don't have to do it today or tomorrow, but we will get there. Good on you. If there's an inner voice that's talking like this, then actually all this excessive striving and perfectionism starts to dissipate. And this kind of inner voice is what people actually learn when they learn self-compassion. They learn how to exchange harsh self-criticism for encouragement and support and kindness. And then people can relax. Then they can relax.
And that could be a very long process for people, as you know from work.
Yes.
I mean, that's not. It would be great if it was something that we could just talk about in a podcast episode and give people access to. But these things often take a long time with people, and they're often very deep rooted and really difficult to work with.
It's very deep, very deep. It's about who we are.
Yeah.
And who we are started being created the moment of birth. A lot of what we consider shame proneness is locked in by the time we're 5, I mean, we can develop shame from cultural and systemic oppression and so forth, and we can develop later in life. But when we're shame prone, it often starts with disconnections that may have occurred in the first few years of life before we even had a personality. Moments of emotional disconnection that were persistent over time makes us feel like, what's the matter with me? That's the source of shame. So to get to this cause, to get to the bottom of shame, as you said, Forrest, is a very, very deep and also incredibly fruitful enterprise. But we're not just trying to pull back, the layers of obfuscation and get to this horrible thing at the root. Instead, we're learning to love ourselves up, and then these things will reveal themselves when they can be worked on. In other words, we don't need to do archaeology. What we need to do is to love ourselves up, and shame will yield.
That's so interesting, Chris. I want to ask you about that, because there's this very funny relationship between shame and self-compassion that you've already alluded to here, which is that on the one hand, self-compassion, absolutely incredible antidote for shame, right? We have all these views about ourselves. They're very negative views. If we can find a way to apply more kindness to ourselves, wow, it can really help with those views. On the other hand, shame is incredibly good at blocking a person's ability to apply self-compassion to themselves, because of all the reasons we've talked about, right? The moment the self-compassion comes online, all of these counterexamples, all of these negative thoughts start just bubbling on up. And for starters, again, very difficult to work with, very common problem that people can be experiencing. And also one of the things that I really liked that you guys recommended as an intervention for this kind of problem, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but that's sort of how I thought about you guys positioning it, Was mindfulness based practices focused on evaluating thoughts versus evaluating reality? A lot of the shame thoughts that we have about ourselves are very exaggerated. They're very complete, they're very rigid, and they're out of proportion to what's actually going on around us. And one of the great ways to find counterexamples to that is just by looking into our direct experience. And that's where mindfulness comes in as a tool. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
That sort of gets the ball rolling, a kind of analysis of the situation. But shame is mostly just like trauma, it's in the body, you know, it's deep. So, what you described by, asking ourselves, if I were like, if you're a perfectionist, you say, well, what would it be like if I wasn't perfect all the time? What would happen, and how terrible would that be? This is kind of a cognitive process which opens the door to, I don't have to do that perhaps, or it's not helpful to do that. It basically shines a bright light on what we're doing that is not fruitful. However, to actually transform what has created that edifice in the first place requires deeper work. It requires actually changing our physiology. It requires that we start to feel safe when we feel threatened, when we felt threatened. It requires that we start to feel loved when we felt disrespected or dismissed. It requires that we can hold our trembling heart in a loving embrace when we would otherwise flee. And so the shift in physiology is from a threat state to a care state, from cortisol and adrenaline to oxytocin and the endorphins. We actually have to change the way it feels inside in order to dismantle unrealistic expectations of ourselves.
I think this gets back to what you were saying a couple of minutes ago, Chris, about the different concentric circles that a person could exist in. Right? You've got safety, you've got challenge, and I think the third one was overwhelm. For a lot of people, when they first start encountering these topics, the space of challenge is pretty thin. There's safety and there's overwhelm, and you move through challenge to get to overwhelm pretty darn briskly. So a lot of what this becomes about is, you can talk about it a bunch of different ways. Expanding the window of tolerance is a phrase that people use a lot. It's a little bit of a complicated one. It's got some issues with it, but it's one that you might be familiar with if you're listening to it. Let's say that somebody wants to go through this process. They have enough resourcing internally to be able to apply a bit of self-compassion for themselves. When they apply that self-compassion, maybe they get that backdraft, maybe they're not able to stick with it for very long before moving into overwhelm. What have you found, whether it's a practice or just a process that you go through with people, that helps people start to be able to stay in challenge for a longer period of time before moving into overwhelm, essentially?
Mindfulness.
Yeah.
Mindfulness. So compassion is more activating, emotionally activating than mindfulness. Compassion training can quickly get too hot, and
Yeah.
gets too hot because of backdraft. And mindfulness allows it to cool down. It allows us to anchor our awareness, to stabilize our awareness. So there are actually 4 ways that we apply mindfulness and self-compassion practice. The first one is not necessarily cooling or calming. That is to open to what we're feeling, but also to do it. This is calming as much as possible in an accepting way. And when we know when we're struggling, but with acceptance, it creates a little space around the thing. In other words, a little gap, a little perspective out in which we can be compassionate. So the first way that mindfulness can be helpful is its awareness with acceptance. And that then creates room for a compassionate response. Another way that mindfulness is helpful is, as we were talking about before, anchoring or stabilizing our awareness. In other words, when we are caught in a storm, like an overwhelm, and we want to get back to safety, We can feel the soles of our feet, or we can feel the internal rhythm of the breath, or we can look at something beautiful in our room. Anchoring in present moment awareness is mindfulness practice. And this is really helpful for working with compassion. A third way, and this is really, really interesting, and that is that we can mindfully find emotion in the body. So, for example, if you feel fear, and if you just stayed in your head, you'll be like thinking, okay, what's the threat and where did it come from and how do I avoid it and is it coming after me? We have these kind of, basically, we cannot. Um, our thoughts are so fast that if we want to work with a difficult emotion in the head, it's really hard to do because, frankly, it will outrun us. However, the body is slow, and emotions consist of a physical side and a mental side. So, fear, for example, has a pounding heart or tension in the chest. But fear also, has catastrophizing thoughts and stuff. But if we find, say we're in a moment of fear or a moment of shame or a moment of despair, if we can feel in our bodies, where do I feel fear? Where do I feel shame? Where do I feel despair? And we can actually literally physically hold that part of our body in a compassionate way, it will change the emotion because it's like a system. And when you relate in a new way to part of the system, in this case, the physical expression of a difficult emotion, it starts to subside. So that's the third way. And then the fourth way that mindfulness is really helpful in self-compassion practice is as in the form of equanimity. So mindfulness, which is present moment awareness with acceptance, when we do this long enough, that space expands and we begin to be able to have what we call balanced awareness. We begin to be able to take things as they come a little more with less reactivity. And then when we are able to see things in a kind of a spacious, balanced way, lo and behold, something incredibly precious emerges, which is wisdom. Wisdom. And so we need mindfulness slash equanimity slash wisdom in self-compassion practice so that we can make wise, compassionate choices. If we think we can just decide what to do next based on compassion, we're wrong. We need to know the causes and conditions in which something occurs, in addition to a compassionate heart, in order to know what to do. So mindfulness is really essential in order to regulate our emotions and also going forward in life to be able to choose choices that are actually going to keep us steady and loving.
I think that was a fantastic run through that there, Chris. Very, very helpful. And it also connects, at least in my mind, and I'm curious what your take is on this, to the very first thing we were really talking about, which is that paradox of self-compassion and the ability to be with a feeling without having an agenda associated with it. Because that's equanimity in a way of being. You are present with it without having a view about it or becoming overwhelmed by it.
That's precisely it. Yeah. The essence of that paradox is the essence of mindfulness.
Yeah. Yeah,
Exactly,
totally. Which is
exactly
so
as you
interesting,
said.
right?
This is a kind of operational definition of mindfulness in the context of compassion training.
Yeah. And so it's very normal, again, to be overwhelmed by a feeling. It doesn't make you wrong if you're overwhelmed by a feeling. It's not necessarily a bad sign if you've been unable to apply equanimity in that kind of way. It's totally normal. It's totally natural. And what happens for a lot of people in those different windows of presence, windows of tolerance, is that they get to overwhelm and they go, have some version inside of themselves of the story of, I need to stay here to kind of prove that I can do this. Or other strong people are able to do this for longer, some version of that, right? And, this is the fact that I need to pull back is yet more evidence that, there are all these things that are deeply wrong with me. And we know with 1,000 pieces of evidence that that's just not how it works. Anybody can get overwhelmed. And when we camp out there, we're just giving the brain more evidence that this thing that we're doing is bad. We're not learning something useful and good from it. And so that's just more for like people who are listening who might be going through this kind of a process, who might get a little seduced by that voice of like, just keep
Yeah.
going. Sometimes it's good to not just keep going.
Basically, the greatest danger in self-compassion is overzealousness. People that think, well, first of all, when you start having backdraft, it doesn't seem to be working, then we double down because
Yeah.
then we get extra backdraft. But one way to think about this is it's just really important to have our intention clear. So if we're struggling and then we think, well, I need to like struggle through this, the question is why? Because if you would like to learn compassion and then you're kind of driving yourself over the edge, this is not compassion. You're not practicing compassion. What you're practicing is struggle, stress, and maybe even self-harm. So you don't do it. So
Yeah.
we have to get really clear about our intentions. There's a psychologist, Marsha Linehan, who once said, I heard at a conference here at Harvard, she said, what good is compassion if it doesn't actually help? So backdraft could really it makes compassion tricky, but when we have too much backdraft, it is not helping. And when we respond to backdraft with overzealousness, then it will be harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to be very clear. Why am I doing this? Now, just let me say one thing that in people who practice mindfulness meditation, they often hear when it's difficult, just sit with it, bear with it, and then you're going to learn important insights such as the truth of impermanence, or how the sense of self creates additional suffering, or you might actually begin to dissolve in your pain, and you'll learn the truth of selflessness. In other words, these are insights that lead to wisdom. So some people, their intention is not compassion, their intention is wisdom. And as a result, they may actually get some benefit in sticking it out. But if you are on the compassion path, which is about the alleviation of suffering through kindness, then if you notice that you're doing something that is unkind and not alleviating suffering, stop it.
It's not helping you out
That's
anymore.
the most compassionate thing we can do. Just stop it.
Yeah. And it is so funny how I think very understandably, and maybe it's because we're coming from a place of having real problems, real pain, and wanting some relief when a person's experienced a lot of distress for a long time. Like it's very understandable to keep on plugging away with it. But I think a lot of this just comes down to a person having an appreciation and an acceptance for what they're experiencing right now, where they are inside of their own system, and what is their actual level of capacity. And it's
Yes.
okay to lean on your level of capacity, but you don't want to try to put your fist through the wall because it's just not going to end very well for you most of the time.
No, it's not going to end well. I think that's a beautiful summary, what you just said, Forrest. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate that. So, as we get to the end here, I do want to ask you one question from maybe a slightly different perspective. At the very, very beginning, you were talking about the different misunderstandings that people have about self-compassion and some common misconceptions. And one of them got to the idea of losing your edge. And I want to ask you about a version of that, which is, well, will self-compassion prevent me in some way from doing healthy and appropriate forms of self-correction or self-evaluation? And we haven't really talked about that much during the episode, so I wanted to give you an opportunity here at the end.
No, that's a really good question, particularly in the context of work stress and
Yeah.
burnout. And so one of the most consistent findings that we have in the self-compassion research is we see that people who are high in self-compassion are more willing to admit mistakes, more willing to risk failure, And they're also more able to cope with failure and motivate themselves in the way we described before to achieve their goals. So that whole constellation of, how do we relate to things when things go bad? Self-compassion helps us on many different levels. And I also want to say something about the core paradox. You were saying earlier that we really need to forget about the goal. We don't want to manipulate our experience. We just want to focus on the kindness aspect. It may feel like we're abandoning something important temporarily in order to achieve that goal more effortlessly and strategically. And that's in fact true.
Hmm.
But the other thing is that it actually is a lot of work to radically accept ourselves and our experience as it is now.
Yeah.
It's actually a lot of work, and it's also the most intelligent thing we can do, because when we, Carl Rogers had that beautiful paradoxical, saying that the curious paradox is that when we accept ourselves just as we are, then change happens as if by itself. So it's not like we're giving up on ourselves. What it is we're getting smarter at how we work. By radically accepting ourselves and our moment to moment experience, we are significantly increasing the likelihood that we will in fact succeed and also learn from our failures.
Yeah.
Right? So this is a lot of work. Actually, most people take the easy way out by just focusing on what they want to accomplish, and they ignore how they're trying to go about it, like beating themselves up to achieve it. That is not helpful. And so the sooner we recognize that, the easier and frankly, the more productive our lives will be.
Chris, thanks so much for doing this with me. I thought this was really fantastic. It helped me with my own process around these topics, which I always appreciate. And I think that people will get a lot out of it.
Thank you. You're a very generous interviewer, Forrest, because you're willing to share in your own experience, and that you also kind of roll with the conversation rather than having 20 fixed questions. You're a brilliant interviewer.
Oh, thank you, Chris. I really appreciate that. That means a lot to me.
I'm grateful to have had this opportunity, and I hope it's been helpful to your listeners.
Really loved this conversation with Chris, focused on self compassion. Again, Chris's new book is Mindful Self Compassion for Burnout, and he wrote that with Dr. Kristen Neff, who is one of the original people to do research on self compassion. And I started by asking Chris why so many people seem to struggle with the topic of self compassion. Self compassion seems like it would be a basic good thing. You're being kind to yourself the same way that you would be kind to other people who are going through a difficult time. But it's true that people often cringe at the phrase self compassion. There are a lot of misunderstandings about it, and people can struggle to apply it inside of themselves for a whole bunch of different reasons that we explored during this conversation. One of the reasons that people sometimes struggle with self compassion is that self compassion can surface a lot of complex and difficult content for people. It can pull up a lot of inner resistance. Maybe a person has absorbed a narrative that they have to maintain a certain standard of performance in order to deserve self compassion. So they're only allowed to be kind to themselves when they can accomplish certain kinds of things out in the world. There might be some inner resistance that looks like, how can I feel sorry for myself when so many people have it worse than I do? Or how can I be compassionate to myself when there's a voice inside of me that's telling me all the time that I'm a bad person, that I have done bad things? It's understandably a lot easier to be compassionate to somebody else out in the world when we appraise them as being a basically good person who hasn't done anything wrong. And the reality is that every single person knows every bad thought they have ever had, every bad deed they have ever done. And we compare the full Rolodex of that experience, knowing every single item in the ledger, against our very incomplete view of other people. We talked about backdraft in some detail during the conversation, and this is when an attempt to apply self compassion ends up feeling bad in and of itself. That self compassionate inquiry that you did surfaced all of this material inside of yourself that feels bad For example, you might say something like, I accept myself, a basic self compassion phrase, and that is immediately met by thinking about all of your unacceptable qualities. And this is an example of a bunch of different big topics in psychology. First, it's an example of a kind of repression. We push all of this material down, and when we first start trying to kind of open the door to it, which self compassion can often do, it flows out more strongly than we expect it to. It's also an example of how our content is often highlighted by its opposites. A classic example of this: if I tell you to not think of an elephant, what are you going to do? You're going to think of an elephant. And even very basic self compassionate acts like taking normal breaks from work can trigger those kinds of negative internal voices. After all, if you were really a good person, if you were really effective, you'd be able to keep on working. From there, we really focused the conversation on the topic of shame and working with shame. Shame and self compassion have a complex relationship with each other. On the one hand, self compassion is really fantastic for helping people work with shame. On the other hand, shame is really good at blocking self compassion. And Chris shared I think, a really great roadmap for working with shame and taking a compassionate approach to shame based experiences and emotions that you might be having inside of yourself. First, we talked about the prerequisites for self compassion. In order to apply self compassion, we need three things. We need to be able to perceive that we're struggling. We need to feel a sense of kinship and relationship with others amidst suffering. In other words, our suffering is a normal human experience. Other people suffer too. Other people feel shame. Other people have done bad things. Other people are imperfect, whatever the phrase is to you that really lands and is meaningful. And then third, we need a generally warm and kind attitude towards ourselves. And this is where the very critical inner voice tends to enter the picture. It can be very difficult for people to apply that warm and nurturing voice. So when we're able to develop those three things, we can start to apply self-compassion. But a common problem that people fall into with self-compassion is the belief that it itself, just doing the practice, will solve a problem or cause a pain point to go away. And it might do that. Self compassion can be enough to solve a problem, but we also talked about the paradox of self compassion. We give ourselves self compassion not to solve a problem, but because we feel bad. And that change of focus, that movement from having a pursuit orientation, a action orientation, a solve a problem orientation, into that more world of being with, was a major focus of the conversation. As you start to work with those backdrafts that can come up as you apply self compassion, it's normal to get pushed outside of your window of tolerance, or as some people prefer, your window of presence. And this relates to the model that Chris shared of those three concentric circles where we have safety, then challenge, and then overwhelm. Most of the time, we want to hang out in safety. And then we want to try to expand that world of challenged a little bit. We want to be able to push it out a little further so we can stay in challenged a little longer without falling all the way into overwhelm. Then when we are in overwhelm, the goal is really to exit overwhelm. It's not to try to continue to practice there. And this is, again, a very common mistake or misunderstanding that people have about internal work that is not unique to self-compassion. It's very common when people first learn about things like exposure therapy, and let's say that this is a person who has a fear of drowning, that rather than learning how to swim in the shallow end of the pool, staying in that world of challenge, they instead cannonball off the diving board right into the deep end. Now, all this does is it sets them up for failure. They keep on having more of the bad experiences that led to them believing that self-compassion wasn't for them in the past. And so, of course, once you have that additional bad experience, you're not going to want to return to trying this practice on. And when it comes to expanding that window of presence, Chris really recommended mindfulness-based tools for a couple of reasons. First of all, mindfulness can be a great way in to seeing reality more clearly. Shame-based thinking is by its nature very incomplete. It is rigid, it's one-dimensional, and it tries to compress all of who you are. This very complex individual with, like every other individual, strengths and vulnerabilities, pluses and minuses, things that you've done well and things that you've done poorly, down into this kind of one-dimensional object. And Chris recommended in particular 4 mindfulness practices. It's awareness with acceptance for starters. So we begin with acceptance of what's going on around us. That's acceptance of ourselves, acceptance of our environment, and really trying to see things clearly in that way. Then there could be a kind of anchoring or stabilizing awareness. This is often somatic in nature. You're returning to what is. A practice here might be trying to feel the soles of your feet or your sit bones if you're sitting in a chair. Chris also mentioned that it can be difficult for people to work with hard emotions in their head. We have a lot of thoughts. The mind is a cave of bats. Those thoughts happen very rapidly, and we can find ourselves kind of racing to keep up with them. But the body tends to operate a little bit more slowly. So, can we be mindful of the body? Can we apply some of the tools that Chris talked about? Putting a hand on ourselves in kind of a soothing way, a gentle way. Um, Moving into the more behavioral activation strategies, even could be a version of this. Sensing into your body, taking care of your body, trying to support yourself as you're going through the difficult experience that's causing this backdraft. And then finally, he talked about equanimity, which kind of relates to that core paradox of self compassion. We have balanced awareness. We can take things as they come with less reactivity. We can be with what is without having so much of a judgment about it. And that idea generally of more being without so much doing is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. It's been a big part of my personal practice. And part of that's because it's something that I kind of struggle with. As I said during the conversation, I'm a big doer. I like to move into action around stuff. And when we're having a conversation with other people, we can experience this kind of intuitively, right? We know that just immediately launching into problem solving is not necessarily going to be the best way to interact with our friend who's having a hard time. It can seem insensitive, it can seem like we just don't get it, all of that stuff. But when we're with our own emotions, just speaking personally, it is so easy to go into the problem solving mode without actually being in the more experiencing mode for a long enough period of time for your body to actually feel safe and comfortable. And it's from that safe base that we can then do all of this very useful work. I hope you enjoyed the conversation today. Again, it was with Dr. Chris Germer. Chris is a great guy. He is also the author of a whole bunch of different books, including The Mindful Path to Self-Compassion and his most recent book with Dr. Kristen Neff, Mindful Self-Compassion for Burnout, that just came out recently. And I've included a link to it in the description of today's episode. If you've somehow made it this far without subscribing to the podcast yet, please subscribe. That would really help us out. We'd really appreciate it. If you'd like to support us in other ways, you can find us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/beingwellpodcast. And for the cost of just a couple of dollars a month, you can support the show and you'll get a bunch of bonuses in return. You can also leave a rating and a positive review on places like Spotify or Apple. And the absolute best way that you can support the show is by telling somebody else about it. Until next time, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon.